This recollection excludes the women and otherwise identifying people whom I've loved or thought I had, focusing entirely on those whose maleness preceded their identity and also excluding those to whom the latter applies while the former does not. Only men I have loved. The first man I loved was my father. And before you look at me funny, love has many forms. And in this form, his childlike wonder he held into adulthood as a result of his presence on the spectrum allowed him to bond with me in a way he couldn't with his peers, my mother, his coworkers, or even my older sister, though I'd imagine they must have had a similar relationship when she was my age. I idolized him for his ability to tinker and solder and his willingness to feed my appetite for petite knowledge on many topics, tiny redemptions of grandiose unknowns, like why dolphins breathe air, or what happens when a star turns into a red giant and then a white dwarf. I lost him as I grew older, and he grew violent not toward me, but with his words to my mother and toward objects in the room, though I realize now his emotions, unmediated and unmedicated, made true violence more like objects in the mirror. I found him again in understanding his inability to connect with people, making an effort to love him as he had me by feeding what I had needed and by explaining things I didn't understand. Like why she looks at him that way or why my sister moved so far. The second man I loved was a bastard. I was 13 and he was not. He slinked into my parents' basement to whisper me lies about our future with a serpent's tongue, but I love snakes. And the vigor with which life thrust me into a consequent life of crime was exhilarating until the fall because I bit the apple, and then I saw the truth and the lies and the things in between, and that it was all in between, and that I was a fleeting tool on the stop to what would ultimately be a series of endings, a restraining order, and a sugar mama whose daddy sent cars to follow me to school. The third man I knew looked at me in a way I didn't find again for quite some time. Right off the bat, hey, batter, batter, and we swung low, sweet chariot all the way to his home every evening, smoking too much weed to remember how much weed we smoked. He was grand when he was grand, and he was small when he wasn't, feeding on my illness and dramaticisms, imitating them when he felt the need to pull closer to me, punching holes in his walls and shaving half his body to figure himself out, and then leaving me for the same characteristics he wanted me for in the first place. He ripped himself from me, and I plugged the wound with the next man, who I latched onto as more of an idea than a decision. But then I was locked in. And I stayed there for quite some time, like a frog in the water. At first, the summer was exciting, like so much had been in the past, but when I realized I didn't like swimming, I stayed anyway because I was already there, and the light behind his eyes never really turned on or even flickered on its way to fluorescence. I didn't blame him until we didn't talk about it, lying to each other and finding gratification elsewhere. Him in dishonesty and deception, and other women and in desperation, and me in falling into myself, imploding under the weight of constant reinvention I hoped would set me free, to love him like I wish I could, but eventually I did. But more like a leaky faucet I wished I could wrench so tight it could serve us both. It served neither of us, and the trying made me tired. When I finally got the courage to move to a place with better facilities, the water it sprayed at me was boiling. Had I not tried hard enough to fix the leak? Or was that the way it was designed and the fault was not to be had by either of us? I haven't yet figured it out. Now, I love a man whose body is as warm as his words to me, and as soft as the luminescence in his gaze at me in the mornings, and in the afternoons, and I guess in the evenings too, wouldn't you know? And in the middle of the night. And whenever he sees me, and he does see me for what I am, and encourages it without pressure, I see him as a relief of a man whose integrity is almost as strong as his wit and conviction, and whose radiance I have only begun to accept I deserve. It's less of a wildfire, though it began as such, and at times we pour on gasoline to experience it again, but we love it the same when it's more of a crackling of kindle, warming the air when it's crisp. It's dumb how handsome the horizon is when I'm not scared of what will rise behind it. And how beautiful the curvature of the earth, which I've never been so grateful to share. God, it's so dumb.